Demands for a ceasefire grow louder as Israel's assault on Gaza continues. Deadly airstrikes are destroying Palestinian lives, but who is coming to their defense? And will Israel be held accountable? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the plight of the Palestinians. In less than 2 weeks of fighting, more than 200 people have been killed, almost half of them women and children. Israeli airstrikes continue raining down on one of the most densely populated places on earth, the Gaza Strip. And Israel says it will not stop until Hamas is degraded. In spite of international calls for a ceasefire, air raids are decimating Gaza's homes and businesses. There's been plenty of condemnation, but action is in short supply. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, a group of 57 Muslim-majority countries, has slammed Israel for its attacks on Palestinians. Here's the Saudi foreign minister speaking at the OIC meeting.
Saudi Arabia categorically rejects and strongly condemns the provocative Israeli plans and measures which aim to forcefully evacuate Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem and impose their sovereignty over them, and all the military actions that cause civilian casualties, including innocent women and children.
Now, statements like that may be forthcoming, but who or what can actually stop the bombardment of Gaza? Let's ask our panel. And joining us from Washington is Omar Baddar. He is a National Policy Council member at the Arab American Institute and a Middle East political analyst. Azzam Tamimi joins us from Amman, Jordan. He's a political analyst, a presenter at Al-Hiwar TV, and author of Hamas, A History from Within. And Giorgio Cafiero also joins us from Washington. He is the founder and CEO of Gulf State Analytics. It's a geopolitical risk consultancy firm focusing on the Middle East. Thanks so much for being with us, all three. Omar, if I can start with you, it is unfortunate that much of the Arab and Muslim world is so deeply divided over a number of issues. The OIC, though, and the Arab League seem to at least agree on a common oral condemnation of Israel right now, but does that make any material difference to Palestinians?
Unfortunately, not that much. There is no shortage of words of condemnation from around the world. There is near unanimity of the fact that Israel is an occupier in the Palestinian territories, universal agreement that the siege on Gaza is devastating the economy and must come to an end. These things are not controversial, and including now the bombing of Gaza. The problem is that nobody is willing to place meaningful pressure on Israel to put their actions where their words are, to try to get Israel to actually feel some pressure in order to abide by international law and respect Palestinian human rights. And worst of all, of course, is the rhetoric coming out of Washington, where the Biden administration is constantly talking about the importance of putting human rights first and calling, in this case, the Biden administration saying that they support a ceasefire in principle, but actually obstructing an effort to get the UN to declare a ceasefire through the UN Security Council, as well as the Biden administration's refusal to condition U.S. military funding for Israel on Israel behaving in a way that is much more respectable of human rights. That's the fundamental contradiction here, is that the Biden administration claims now, you have press reports saying that they are placing pressure on Netanyahu's government behind the scenes. But Netanyahu knows that as long as the United States is not willing to withhold military funding, then that pressure is really meaningless and nothing more than political rhetoric. And we can expect that Israel can behave however it wants. It will make the unilateral decision about when it's going to stop slaughtering the people in Gaza, which they see as a legitimate form of collective punishment, because Palestinians are not passive in the face of growing ethnic cleansing and really just a complete devastation of their society.
Right. Giorgio, let me ask you, it's no surprise where the United States stands, but we know the Arab and Muslim world, though it's not a single entity, it's in fact divided along lines of war. Lay clear for us, actually, whose interests within those organizations that should be coming to the aid of Palestinians, as many would see it, where those interests lie when it comes to the Gaza and Israel conflict right now.
Thank you. What we're seeing right now is a continuation of certain dynamics that have existed for many years, for decades. Fact of the matter is, we always hear this term Arab-Israeli conflict. I see a conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. Not so sure there's necessarily an Arab-Israeli conflict. As I said, for decades, the vast majority of Arab regimes have been non-confrontational actors in this conflict. For many of the Arab League members, the violence taking place on Gaza and Israel proper, East Jerusalem and the West Bank is one big headache. It is a headache because it represents serious political risks for these regimes who have populations that do largely care about the Palestinian issue. But let's be clear, these governments have no interest in taking any concrete action that goes beyond rhetoric. What we saw last year in 2020 was 4 new Arab governments actually formalize diplomatic relations with Israel. These countries want to move ahead with their partnerships with Israel and benefit in all the ways that the Abraham Accords can enable them to benefit. Said it before, but I'll say it again. What's going on now is just simply a headache and political risk for these governments, really nothing more.
Quickly, though, Giorgio, expand on what you think that benefit actually is. Especially, I mean, some of them are dictatorships, but when they know that their public's own hearts are with the Palestinian people, and they move against those public interests, what really is the benefit?
Well, you know, for some of these states, they want to work with Israel to counter Iran's influence in the region, to counter Turkey's influence in certain instances. They want to benefit from Israeli technology. They want to benefit from tourism from Israel. These are the sort of economic and geostrategic factors that inform their perspectives on Israel right now.
Fascinating. Azzam, let me ask you, you've questioned whether the Arab League or the OIC will force Egypt to open its Gaza borders and whether they can actually force member states who have diplomatic relations with Israel to at least threaten punitive action. Do you think either will happen?
No, never. I don't think it will happen. Neither will happen. You see, most Arab regimes feel they share a destiny with Israel. And this is especially so since the Arab Spring, because the Arab Spring was a popular uprising against these dictators, against these corrupt tyrants in the region, who today feel safer with Israel than with their own peoples. And therefore, I agree with what has been said. For them, what's going on at the moment is no more than a headache. They would have preferred for it not to happen because it does agitate and incite their masses, but it wouldn't make them take action. So it's a lot of talk, but no action whatsoever.
Azzam, let me stick with you because you have made many times the apartheid comparison when considering really how the world should respond to what is happening in Gaza and how it could be brought to an end. I want you to explain some context first because, you know, for years, the United Kingdom and the US, they backed the apartheid regime as an ally against the Soviets during the Cold War. So why does the US, the EU, and the UK back Israel in the way they do today?
Well, there are many similarities between the apartheid regime in South Africa and Israel. Both are colonial or originally colonial projects. Both had very profound links to the West, to the Western imperialist powers. Both justify their existence on alleged divine promise that God in white Africa favored the whites, whereas God in Israel favors the Jews. Now, Israel for the United States of America and Europe is a lot more important than any other colonial project of the past. because in one respect, it is the sense of guilt that the West feels about what happened to the Jews. But more importantly, really, Israel is a tool of Western hegemony. Israel, as so many Americans put it before, as well as Israelis, is like a floating a floating ship serving the United States of America and its allies. And as in the case of apartheid in South Africa, world powers will not change their position and favor the oppressed. In the case of South Africa, it was the blacks. In the case of the Middle East, it's the Palestinians, unless the struggle against Zionism, as in the case of the struggle against apartheid, reaches global dimensions.
Okay, Omar, I'm wondering if you agree with the analogy there, and if you see, you know, what Azzam so clearly describes as an apartheid-like regime in the Palestinian territories, unwinding in the same way internationally, the way apartheid did back in its day.
There is no question that we're witnessing right now that what Israel is imposing in Palestine is apartheid. That's at this point also non-controversial because even major human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch have reached that conclusion, and even Israeli human rights organizations have reached that conclusion as well, like B'Tselem have said that Israel is imposing apartheid on Palestinians. As far as the reason why other countries back this apartheid regime, I think that there is some distinctions here that are worth noting. I think Azzam is absolutely right in saying that Israel is essentially a tool of regional domination. When you look at the history of when the U.S. started backing Israel with massive funding, it was Israel defeating 3 Arab countries in 1967 in a mere 6 days that had the United States decide to grow its military funding of Israel by more than 100-fold. That's because they saw that Israel is a powerful country in the region, and they saw that it was useful for them to be allied with a powerful country that exactly serves as a massive American military base in some way. However, the United States would be content with Israel within the borders that the United Nations recognized and does not really need the occupation of the Palestinian territories, does not need this growing apartheid system and the ethnic cleansing and the siege and the suffocation. Those human rights violations that are just absolutely condemnable by everyone are actually a cost for the United States. And the reason why the U.S. keeps backing them is in part due to the pressure of the Israel lobby here within the United States. President Obama, for example, clearly got what the problem was. He spoke on multiple occasions about the fact that Palestinians do not live a free life and that they're entitled to that freedom. And yet he was never willing to pay the political cost of placing meaningful pressure on Israel. And that's exactly what we're witnessing again with the Biden administration. There is a reluctance to confront Israel, to demand something better of it that would actually serve America's interests, which is to stop behaving like a vandal state. And Israel, of course, refuses to comply. And no administration is willing to pay the political cost. They know that if they withhold military funding from Israel, it's going to be a fight with the Congress because of the extent of the influence of the Israel lobby within the United States. However, that is beginning to change. And I think it's incredibly important that this mythology that you can never say no to the Israel lobby is beginning to break. You had Eliot Engel, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the U.S. Congress, very powerful member of Congress, backed by AIPAC, supports a regressive foreign policy towards the Middle East. And he was defeated by a newcomer by the name of Jamal Bowman, who was speaking openly about his support for Palestinian human rights. So this idea that you cannot challenge the Israel lobby is a myth, and it's beginning to break. And we're seeing more and more members of Joe Biden's parties beginning to speak out in Congress against Israeli crimes. And that's the beginning of a shift that I think will eventually have much more impact.
Okay. So, Giorgio, I mean, there's the existence of the Israel lobby as one fundamental difference. There's also, many would argue, the fact that they don't feel the Palestinians have the Nelson Mandela that the black South Africans had under apartheid, and that instead they have Hamas, which Israel has been able to use as the perfect scapegoat for continuing to bombard Gaza in the form that it is. Not the West Bank, but Gaza.
Yeah, I would, first of all, I agree with what the guest just said about how the conversation is changing in Washington. And, when we look at the U.S.-Israel relationship in the period of time that followed the 9/11 attacks, Israel was really able to exploit fears that the United States had of extremism from the Islamic world And the Israeli leadership was quite successful in sort of pushing this narrative that the US struggle against Al Qaeda and similar extremist groups was one and the same with Israel's struggle against Hamas. Never mind the fact that Hamas and these other groups like Al Qaeda have fundamentally different goals. Putting that aside, the Israeli message was that this was all one common struggle against radical Islam. That narrative is really weakening right now. We're seeing younger and more progressive figures within the Democratic Party saying things on the floor of the House that 10 years ago I would have never expected a U.S. lawmaker to say. 10 years ago, I don't remember any Democrats on the floor of the House calling Israel an apartheid state. So while U.S. policies have not been changing, the conversation is changing. And in order to change policies, we need to first change the conversation. And that has definitely happened. And we can definitely conclude that this idea that criticizing Israel is political suicide, that is done. Over.
Okay, it can be a slow process, but I'm glad, Giorgio, you are seeing some momentum at the very least in Washington. Let me put this point to all three of you. You know, Israel can make whatever claims it wants about Hamas, some legitimate, some not, but what precedes all of this is the illegal occupation of Palestinian land, an occupation that continues to expand in total contravention to international law, where there's been absolutely no accountability for taking other people's land and their homes. So at its most basic level, why won't the international community at least stop that? Omar, let me put that to you first.
Sure. Your description is absolutely accurate. There's a lot of, rhetoric about who started this round of violence. Israel is inherently the initiator of violence because the status quo before any rockets were fired was that Israel is an occupier in the Palestinian territories. Israel's claim to self-defense is every bit as absurd as an armed intruder breaking into your home and then saying that they are defending themselves when violence breaks out. It's really a travesty. And the problem is that the international community is perfectly willing to say that this occupation is wrong and to demand for it to end and to oppose settlements. Nobody is willing to pay the political cost. That's what we keep going back to, is that there is just this aversion to getting embroiled in a conflict with Israel for reasons that just really don't make any sense for much of the world. I mean, I get it in the United States, the patron, where, by the way, there is the most significant responsibility because every single American taxpayer is essentially funding occupation and apartheid and ethnic cleansing. It really is a stain on our moral conscience in this country that this policy continues, that we are the patrons of apartheid and we are the ones who are using the U.S. veto more than 40 times at the United Nations to shield Israel from accountability. That is part of the problem, right? The United States intervention to prevent the world community from holding Israel accountable is one part of it. Another part of it is U.S. interventions to prevent Palestinians from going to the International Criminal Court to initiate investigations. A lot of it comes back to the United States insisting on shielding Israel from any accountability and much of the world not wanting to get into a conflict with the United States over this particular issue. So the dynamic, while I don't want to let anybody off the hook, certainly every country in the world can do more in terms of joining the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, boycotting Israeli settlement products. There are so many things that should be no-brainers, but ultimately it really falls on the shoulders of Washington as the one country that has so much pull and so much leverage over Israel to start pushing Israel to behave within the bounds of international law. And until that happens, unfortunately, it looks like Israel, the message Israel gets is that it can go on behaving however it wants. And while it's great that we're seeing a shifting in public discourse and the public conversation about this, where there's so much more widespread recognition of the injustice that Israel imposes on Palestinians, unfortunately, we have not gotten to the point to where there is meaningful policy that can nudge Israel in a better direction.
Okay, Azzam, I'll take your thoughts on that, but I also want you to tell me if you think a two-state solution is even possible anymore. What is the end game here? Even if a ceasefire is reached, the fundamental problems remain, and we know the cycle of violence will continue.
Well, with regard to the two-state solution, it's over. There is no more land for Palestinians to set up a state on anyway. But let me address something you said. I think it's important that I go to that point. You brought up the issue of Nelson Mandela and Hamas. Now, Nelson Mandela had been in existence for many years before he was recognized later on as a hero for the struggle and liberation of the people of South Africa. Nelson Mandela was once labeled as a terrorist by Margaret Thatcher herself. So people who talk about Hamas or describe Hamas as a terrorist organization today will probably one day consider it to be the Nelson Mandela of the Palestinians. So we need to be careful about comparisons, because when the people of South Africa were struggling against apartheid, and apartheid was supported by the bloody West, the strugglers against apartheid were considered to be terrorists. Today they are heroes. And I still remember the day when Nelson Mandela came to Britain and he was treated as a hero, whereas Margaret Thatcher once warned that he was a terrorist who would never be allowed to set foot on British soil. And I remember once I gave a speech in a rally in Trafalgar Square, right in the center of London, and I said, and Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was still alive at that time, and I said, I look forward to the day when I see Sheikh Ahmed Yassin set foot on this soil here in London, just as Nelson Mandela did.
Okay, I mean, I would have accepted pretty openly, sometimes people had made comparisons between Yasser Arafat as arguably what could have been the Nelson, but no,
never,
I'm not sure.
never.
I'm not sure there would be a lot of agreement with Hamas comparing Hamas to Mandela. Go ahead, sorry.
If you allow me. I'll tell you a very brief story about this.
We only have a couple minutes left, but if you can, very quickly.
Yes, when I visited South Africa in 1996, I was told that Nelson Mandela was once told that people in Palestine, or some people say Yasser Arafat is the Nelson Mandela of Palestine. He replied, according to them, by saying, no, he is the Botolezi of Palestine and not Nelson Mandela. He could tell the difference between a struggler and a sellout.
Okay. I think that'd be an interesting debate and have an entire program on that. But let me get to Giorgio. We just have a few minutes left, Giorgio. I mean, the bottom line here is that this continuing aggression and violence is all building greater resentment and anger that may never allow Israelis and Palestinians to live in peace. So do you see any points of light in this conflict right now to lead to some sort of resolution where Israel and Palestine can live in peace?
I'll never give up hope for an end to this conflict. It's worth pursuing. Unfortunately, I think things will probably get uglier before they get better.
Sorry, Giorgio, I was interrupted quickly. You have some more time, but let me then get Omar's final thoughts on that, where you see the points of light. I mean, I hope you can say the same, that you will never lose hope. I'd rather hear that kind of optimism, because a lot of people don't feel that way right now.
Certainly, there's no question that the hope that we see is in the fact that discourse is shifting on this across the entire world. It was, as Giorgio had mentioned earlier, just seeing what the comments that are coming out of the U.S. Congress in condemnation of Israel's behavior is really unprecedented. That really, and the fact that American public opinion, when we do opinion polls, you see that a majority of Democrats at this point favor placing conditions on U.S. funding for Israel because of Israel's violations of Palestinian human rights. That is a massive shift that was not there 10 years ago. We have not seen it in successive Israeli wars on the Palestinians in the past. But in terms of the resistance that I think is worthy of glorifying in Palestine, I really think that it's the nonviolent protesters who are demanding accountability for Israel, who are putting their bodies on the line, just the nonviolent struggle that is calling for a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that is turning out, demanding that Israel stop building the wall on their land. That, to me, is the kind of resistance that is most impactful. I think the Palestinian leaderships, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, have really failed to live up to this moment. And I don't think that their actions have been particularly positive. And frankly, I think they have both been repressive towards the Palestinians to a great degree. But I see the calls for genuine popular resistance coming from civil society from the ground up as the thing that is most inspiring that is unfolding in Palestine. And I'm seeing that really echo and reach people across the entire world. And it's really the beginning of a change.
Okay. Omar Baddar, I will give you the final word because that will bring us to an end for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of our panelists so much for joining us. I'm sure we will be speaking again in the near future. Hopefully there will be some progress made on at the very least, coming to a ceasefire agreement so that this present cycle of violence can stop, and hopefully we will be talking about more movements on the peace process going forward. But until then, I'd like to thank you for joining us and thank, of course, our viewers for tuning in as well for this edition of the Newsmakers. We'll see you next time.